So let's begin with this, and that is why this conversation is so important. It is important because every 28 hours, a young man, a young black man, is killed in one way or another by law enforcement, whether it is police, whether it is security guards, whether it is prison guards, someone under the color of authority. This is important because we have a lineage going back to Emmett Till and even further back. And we know that Emmett Till's name has been the name invoked most frequently in any discussion about George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin's murder, and George Zimmerman's acquittal. All across the country, there are conversations now asking the question of whether the American justice system really is justice or whether it is just us, and whether African Americans and other people of color are outside of the scope and the loop of American justice. People are asking questions, is the criminal justice system inherently anti-black? Can we really expect justice? And what role do the social assumptions about African Americans and other people of color play in their being profiled, in their being arrested, in their being convicted, in their being targeted in the criminal justice system? If this system, this justice system, if it was not created, if it does not exist for the purpose of protecting all of its citizens, including people of color, then how do we turn the vulnerability that we have in our communities with our children, our grandchildren, our nieces, nephews, those whom we love, how do we turn that vulnerability into strength? How do we turn our hopelessness into action? And in the aftermath of this verdict, the Zimmerman verdict, what is our responsibility for change? So with that as the overlay, I would just like to start our question to the panelists with this. In Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, she writes, Human Rights Watch reported in 2000 that in 7 states, African Americans constituted between 80 to 90% of all drug offenders sent to prison. In at least 15 states, blacks are admitted to prison on drug charges at a rate from between 20 to 57 times greater than white men. And my question for you is, what is going on?
You know, Michelle, when she wrote her book, and I had the deep honor of teaching her when I taught at Vanderbilt University, and she always has talked about this entire issue of just racism in the criminal justice system. Derek Bell, if you're familiar with his work on critical race theory, Bell talks about the idea that no matter what laws are passed in the United States, undergirding all of it is racism and the ability of a white supremacist society to overturn those laws. So we saw that demonstrated a couple of months ago with the Voting Rights Act. I'm old enough to remember the Voting Rights Act, and it was gutted just two months ago. And if I had thought 50 years or almost 50 years from when it was passed, I would have said it would be impossible to do this. So the incarceration of black males is part of a system globally that incarcerates black males. You can go to England, France, Australia, and black males are incarcerated. And as a psychologist, I have to ask the question why, but we may not have time to get into that, but I think I know. But.
Camilla?
Thank you. And I sat a long time like, what's going on here? Well, racism, years of building a system that depends on people, and people have their inherent biases. So even when you have principles, and I like laws, and I like the rule of law, and I think we can have a justice system that is fair, and I think the principles of the justice system can be fair. But when you've got people who are implementing the laws, people who are choosing how to enforce the laws, people who are judging who's guilty and who's not guilty, and all of those people have their own implicit biases, their explicit biases, but the ones that scare me most are the implicit ones, and don't recognize it. You've got all of these decision points throughout a criminal justice system where racism can sneak in and affect how the system works and whether the system's just.
Thank you. Mr. Neverdon, you can answer that question too, but I also want to ask, a lot of people have stated that the verdict was just, that the jury did exactly what the law required, and that the protest, the exclamations that this verdict was unfair is based on people not really having an understanding of what the law is and how the law works. Your thoughts?
Well, I think one of the things that should be understood is, and let me first be clear that it was an injustice how the verdict turned out. And I say that because the prosecutor's responsibility is to lay out a case in which they believe substantially will produce the outcome of a conviction. And you have to think about what goes into bringing that out. And it really goes into bringing out or specifically focusing on those facts that meet the certain elements required in any given law. A prime example is we have, just for very briefly a little legal education, we have mens rea and actus rea. One is the mental capacity or the intent to think about something that you want to do, and the actus rea is the actual act of what it is. And there's a notion that one generally intends the outcome of their actions. So in this case, if you just take that basic, simple principle of law, if you get out of your car, if you follow a young black male who you don't believe has the right to be in your neighborhood, and you're heard on a audio tape where you're giving his every movement, it is unequivocally clear in my mind that you have an intent to confront this person, and therefore you are the aggressor. And we know even when they tried to put a spin on from a law enforcement standpoint, every citizen has a right to resist an unlawful arrest. So that's just the basis of that. But when we go a little deeper into this, unfortunately, the prosecution put forth a horrific case. They overcharged, and then they allowed certain things to come into play. When you start looking at, from a law enforcement standpoint, the use of force or the stand your ground law, that muddled up what the jury really was confronted with. This was no other incident other than homicide, which it was medically defined. And the problem that I'm finding in our system is that we're allowing medical persons to define homicide, but not necessarily attach legal definitions with that. And that's why we leave that up to a jury. But as a prosecutor, when you don't lay the facts out that says it's the intentional taking of a life of another human being, that is a homicide. And so you then have to go back into each piece. Was it the intended act? Of course it was. Was it the life that was taken of someone? Of course it was. So we've met that definition, but then there comes into play the other pieces, which are the stand your ground, which should be abolished as far as I'm concerned, because what you're doing is you're opening up Pandora's box for evangelism, and that's what's going to end up happening. But there has to be a more realistic look of how did this unfold? And so the problem is it is the portrayal of what is naturally assumed when an African-American male is seen. The first thing that we associate are negative connotations. And we see that all the time. If you look at the news on a regular basis, what is portrayed? We see the 4 o'clock news, the 5 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news. There's some crime that is occurring, and it is generally portrayed that of an African-American male. And then what was mentioned before, and Dr. Winbush really begins to drive it home, the United States incarcerates anywhere from 40 to 50% of the world's population, the United States alone. So let's look at the disproportionate numbers of African Americans that represent the number of persons that are incarcerated in the United States. And that gives you a more global perspective of the disproportionality of how we are represented. And so when you look at that and this outcome, we are the sum of our experiences. So when a jury comes in, they bring their experiences to the table. They go, what was learned, behaviors that have been taught to them, and then you have a prosecution who really, for all intents and purposes, it doesn't appear to me that they really wanted to bring forth their case. So they do things that says, well, I'm satisfying the law, but my heart's not into it. If you're going to prosecute a case, you look for what is the likelihood of success, and that's it. And from a defense standpoint, my job is not to prove that you're innocent beyond a reasonable doubt, but just to find the loopholes and where your case is at its weakest. That was an easy case to win when you don't really put your ducks in a row and you ensure that a jury can follow from step A to step B, that this is a case that really is very simple. They did a lot of other things outside the scope of what I thought was appropriate, but it was allowed and it was permitted. I agree with the panelists that yes, the system can work when we have the right people in place.
Thank you. So, Fraser Smith, Mr. Neverdon talked about the representation of black men in the media. As you viewed all of the circumstances and all of the media coverage around the Trayvon Martin trial, and also I think you're aware of the Christopher Brown. Were you aware of that situation too?
Vaguely.
That happened here? So when you look at things like that, what is your assessment of the media and the role of media in helping to create an atmosphere where a black victim can be put on trial even though he was the victim, that they're being put on trial because they wore a hoodie or, because of societal expectations of black men?
Well, the media certainly does have some responsibility in creating an atmosphere in which profiling goes on. It's not just the police, it's everyone that's profiling, with some exceptions. But I just saw a movie called Fruitvale. Maybe you all know about this movie. It's about a young man. It's another Trayvon Martin case, except you didn't have the intervention of the courts. You just had the police. It was basically a police riot. There was an altercation on a train in Oakland. And the police were called, and they basically cleared the train. Some of these black partygoers were getting off at this stop, and as they were getting off, they were thrown up against the wall and there was an altercation. The police were creating this. I mean, media was not there for that, but, it's up to this point, I don't think what I'm saying is really very controversial. And I don't mean to go too much more than what was being said here, none of which I disagree with. But of course, if you look at all the newscasts that you're talking about, if it bleeds, it leads. And the points have been made over and over to TV news that this is doing what we all know it is doing, and it doesn't change. So I have no really brief for television news, which I'm not involved in. So I'm going to exempt myself from that blame. But what we need to get at somehow is, and it's a long-term process, but what we have to get at is why so many of us do look at all the symbols we're talking about here and see a threat to ourselves that somehow or another we need to respond to. It's a huge issue. I mean, the Maryland Humanities Council and others have tried to convene meetings and talk about race in this state. People won't go. They don't want to be in a situation where someone is going to accuse them of being a racist. And whether or not that is the right terminology to use, we need another approach if we really do want to have the conversation that the president has talked about and that Eric Holder has talked about. And somehow or another, it's not happening. It could happen. But something like Fruitvale Station, it's absolutely sickening to watch. I mean, you know what is going to happen It's a police riot. It was provoked by the police. Let me just say one more thing. I don't mean to be giving everybody an ear beating here, but I heard David Simon speak recently, and he said that one of the results of the war on drugs is that police don't know how to police anymore. They don't know how to make cases. What they know how to do is throw people up against the wall and go into their pockets looking for illegal drugs, because that's what their superiors are asking them to do. So they're sort of the first line against what's going on here. And so we end up with this epidemic, it's being called, of incarceration, which people here, I'm sure, know is so destructive of communities. I mean, it's ruining lives, it's ruining communities, and it needs to stop. And so finally, the Attorney General of the U.S. and the President are saying what needs to happen. And to go back to the media, I mean, if the media doesn't somehow figure out how to get on board here, then I don't know what hope there is. I mean, the kinds of things that are in people's minds will take a long time to erase.
You know, your point about police and policing becoming just an action where police come into a community and throw people up against the wall, and that's the extent of it. On one radio show, one police official said, to be perfectly frank, some communities are to be protected and other communities are to be policed. And this was a Baltimore City police official who said this. So Dr. Winbush, as a history scholar, can you take us back to the beginning and really talk about the origins of the criminal justice system? Was it developed to police, or was it developed to protect? And if so, what communities?
Well, you know, very simply, I actually looked at some numbers on this. The lowest time that black people in this country were incarcerated, the lowest number was during slavery. Okay? That should tell you everything right there. It started escalating after 1865, the so-called end of the Civil War. We know about the sharecropping system, which was a form, I mean, not judicially, but it was a form of incarceration, prison convict labor and so forth. So it escalated, as Michelle says, after the so-called war on drugs, which is really a war on black people. But see, what I think is important is like what you said about these communities. Yesterday I was looking at Bloomberg, who was fuming about the fact that they stop and frisk in New York City, supposedly. So Bloomberg, during his news conference, said, a reporter asked him whether or not his legacy was going to be kind of tarnished because this law had been done away with. And Bloomberg said, and this is almost an exact quote, he said, "I think my legacy will be intact because I had people, the average citizen in New York did not have to look over his shoulder." So I said, I did. Latino brothers did. So he ain't talking to me. He's talking to white folks. And he said that. Now, he doesn't know that he said that, you know, because he's in a system that, you know, that you don't have to, when you talk about us, you know, it's like, what is, Toni Morrison talks about who black people are. When did black people become Americans? It certainly wasn't during slavery, and it certainly wasn't during the Jim Crow era. And we wonder now whether or not Trayvon was viewed as an American, or am I viewed as American, or a brother right here, or all of us. And see, it's not just black men, because look what happened to Oprah 3 days or 3 weeks ago in Switzerland. She can't even buy a purse without being, you know, doubt raised upon her ability to do it simply because of the color of their skin. One of the things I'm frustrated as an educator, I always hear parents saying to me, you know, Dr. Winbush, if the brothers would just pull their pants up and quit wearing white shirts and sneakers, you know, everything will be all right. You know, Malcolm got shot in a suit. Dr. King's head was blown off with a suit and a tie. It doesn't make any difference about that. This color of the skin is what is seen as being first and primary in terms of rating and evaluating police work. So the origins of the criminal justice system, I mean, legally you could say it's English common law and all of that, but in this country it has always been to protect white citizens against black citizens. You should read the history of the Second Amendment when the so-called founding fathers were putting all that stuff together. They were afraid that enslaved black people in the South was going to they were going to rise up against white people. So they said, look, y'all got to have some arms, right to bear arms, and so forth. And then this final point, I'll just shut up after this. The NRA, that real progressive organization, up until Huey Newton and Bobby Seale walked into the Sacramento state capitol in the late 60s. Up until then, the NRA supported carrying guns for everybody. But when black men said, we're going to carry guns publicly and legally, that's when the NRA said, we've got to start arming white America. That's history. It's not anything I'm making up either.
Thank you. So,
okay, I'm going to shut up.
Roberson, Mr. Neverdon, you all expressed a real belief in the criminal justice system, knowing that at its best it can work. My question is, how is it working for youth of color? Is it working?
No.
In any respect? And if not, what needs to happen in order to change that dynamic?
Yeah, I looked at this question when you sent it, and all I got to was no, it's not working in any respect. Now, my advocacy deals with youth who have been charged as adults and how they get into the system. So they can be waived up, or they can be charged with a crime, and based on their age, they're automatically sent into the adult system. Nationwide, African American youth are treated more harshly at every decision point and get thrown deeper and deeper and deeper into the system, and that is racism. They are arrested, they're more likely to be arrested, they're more likely to be detained pre-trial, they're more likely to be waived up into the adult system, they're more likely to be charged with crimes that will put them automatically in the adult system, and Maryland is no exception to this. So for instance, a black youth in Maryland who's 16, if he's charged with assault 1, he's thrown into the adult system. If he's charged with assault 2, he starts in the juvenile system. Whole lot of kids are charged, African American kids are charged with assault 1, so they're all in the adult system. And then you start looking at the statistics, and the other kids are getting assault 2, different things, so they start in the juvenile system. It's not working at any point. And one of the things that we are constantly talking about is, first we have to get rid of mandatory everything. When dealing with youth especially, we have to look at the sentencing guidelines and adjust those. And then we have to start training the people who are in charge of it. Training the officers who make the arrests and do the charges, which is scary to me. Training the judges, training the prosecutors, making sure that the prosecutors and the defense counsel are equally funded. I mean, it could go on and on and on.
So, Mr. Neverdon, tell me then, why should citizens believe in the criminal justice system? I mean, there's not one good thing that we have discussed thus far that speaks to justice. Why should we continue to believe in the system that is not working for us and never has?
Well, I can't say that it never has. Being born and raised in Baltimore City, I do remember a time in Ashburton community where I was raised, where we had young men who, if they engaged in something that was considered illegal, and you got to bear in mind, at 46, we're talking about years ago, where we had officers who walked the beat, who could come sit on my grandmother's steps, get a drink of water, lemonade, find out what's going on in the neighborhood, talk to them to find out what's going on. And then at the same time, if someone got into trouble, the sentiment of the community was not, oh God, what did the police do? How did they set them up? But it was generally where that person went through the system, it was, I sure hope he learns his lesson and can come back a better person and is going to do things differently. Well,
Excuse me, and this was before mandatory.
before we had the mandatory sentencing things. And so what we're dealing with is we're dealing with a time where the community believed in the police and they believed in the system. Doesn't mean that everything was perfect, because we still had some racial undertones and things of that nature, but we still had a more unified community in a system where people believed in it. And right now, we don't have that anymore. There is substantial distrust in the police department with some of the things we've talked about, and there's a substantial disbelief in the current administration of the state's attorney's office, where unfortunately young African-American men are being disproportionately incarcerated, which the sister said right here. You pose the question of what things can happen or what can we do to make things different. The first thing is we have to look at the value of our children. That's the first thing. I believe, and some say, well, how can you say that? And in some of the things that are committed and the crimes that are committed. But the bottom line is opportunity. I believe that there's good in everyone. And if we're given opportunities and choices, realistic, positive choices, for the most part, we're going to make the right choice. But when you have a lack of education, when you have no job skills, and when you have a dysfunctional family and home that you're coming from, when we're dealing with high levels of lead paint exposure, and when you're dealing with kids who are born of drug-dependent parents, and you throw all that into one mix, you've got a cocktail for failure, particularly when no one is reaching out to do anything about that. So in order to deal with that, we're going to have to fight the issues on both ends of the candle, so to speak. We got it. Yeah, you break the law, you have to be held accountable, because rules are what govern us and keep us together. But it has to be done so where it's equal, it's balanced, and it's administered to everyone on an equal playing field. No one should be above the law, including our police department. And so we need to have stronger fundamental values that those things are going to be consistent for everyone. And that's the first way that you start to rebuild the trust, as far as I'm concerned, with the community back into the police department. And as far as the state's attorney's office, you lead by example. How can you expect the police to police themselves? There needs to be an independent outside agency or organization that does the investigation, and then the state's attorney's office can, in fact, equitably prosecute those cases.
So you're talking about Baltimore specifically.
Baltimore specifically.
Would this same formula work on a national?
I think it works across the board. We have to re-educate our elected officials, and we have to re-educate our law enforcement that we are, as young African American men, we are citizens, we are human beings, we are men first and foremost. And then you have to look at what is it that has occurred at that point in time. And if you don't start to do that, then you're going to continually have this perpetuated image that there's an automatic assumption of negativity. I think about with my kids when they were going to, and I pulled them out of one particular school, and I won't call that name out, but it's a private school, supposedly faith-based, but they have this doctrine where they were teaching the kids about colors. And when my son came home and said, I don't want to be black. I'm like, what are you talking about? You don't want to be black. He said, well, because such and such said that white is pure, yellow represents richness, and black represents sin. Now, I'm blown. 2 days, I don't get a response. Day 3, my child is out of that school. So those are the things that we have to start to deal with early. So you're now putting in the mind of a young black man who associates the color of my skin represents something negative. And so when we talk about how do we start to begin to deal with it, we've got to start dealing with it at an early age. We've got to start curtailing it at an early age. And I think one of the ways of doing it is we have to invest and recognize the value of our children. And we have to look at each case on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, well, I see Dr. Winbush just bursting with something to say. But let me ask this, or no, you can pass it down. Just say this, because what I hear you talking about, Mr. Neverdon, is two different things. I mean, one is what we need to do systemically, right? What is going on in the criminal justice system, what is going on in terms of profiling, in terms of convictions. So that's one thing. And then I also hear you talking about the personal, and in terms of what we call internalized oppression, those negative messages received by society that we begin to internalize and believe, like, you know, your child coming home and saying, oh, black is the color of sin.
Right.
Well, we have to deal with that regardless, but that is something that is outside of the criminal justice system, and quite frankly, it is not black people holding that in a systemic way that leads us to the outcomes that we see in terms of the discrepancies between who is profiled, who is targeted, who is convicted. So, you know, Dr. Winbush, as you share your remarks, what role do white people have in making these changes? Because white people hold power, hold systemic and institutional power, and even if there is a black or Latino or other face at the top of that particular food chain, they are still operating within a system and within a structure and within societal mores that still value whiteness and carry the negative attitudes about African Americans.
Well, see, I think what we've got to do is, you know, look, only men can end sexism, okay? And only white folks can end racism. And so the burden is not on me to say, let me help end racism. You know, just like I don't think the burden should be on women to help end sexism. I also think that we ask the wrong question. We've got to start really just thinking about how we conceive of things. Usually people will say, well, we're going to have a panel about, is there racism in education, or is there racism in the media, or is there racism in religion? But I think what we've got to do is flip that question around. So we should start asking, is there media in the racism? Is there education in the racism? Because I think the system of racism is part of why your son comes home asking that question. You see, it's not, you know, we know there's racism in education. I mean, it's like, duh, you know, what we've got to do is start conceiving it as a system and say, how do we deal with that system that causes whoever taught your son that black is bad or whatever, or whoever, you know, portrays Jesus as a white guy with blue eyes. I know I stepped on some toes then, but, you know, we've got to start looking at it differently, and I don't think we do that enough.
So wait, before you pass the mic, so then what would your, not solutions, but what would your steps be, you know, for really making that practical and implementation?
Well, first of all, I think that white people, they have to start telling other white people that they are racist. You know, you say, well, what do you mean? You got to, when you hear it, I always ask mixed audiences whether or not, when's the last time you heard the word nigger? I'm just using that as an example. Black folk will raise their, I heard it 2 days ago, or 2 hours ago. White people will say, well, I heard it a week ago. I said, what'd you do about it? I didn't do anything about it. Now, that's just one tiny example of a racial act. But I think that white people have to place the burden on themselves to tell other white people about issues of racism. And they've got to be very sincere about this. And they've got to be very deliberate with it. And they have to quit saying, I'm going to tell black people about a racist incident and maybe they'll nurture me and take care of me while I do this. You know, Langston Hughes had an essay called The Care and Feeding of White People. You know, and black folk do this a lot. We do this a lot. Oprah, I don't know if you saw it today, she apologized. She apologized for, she didn't want the incident in Switzerland to get so big. She wants to take care of white people. And I love Oprah, but she still wants to take care of white folks. And I think that white folks have to take care of themselves, and I said we can facilitate that, but I think the burden is to turn the question around a lot of times and say, what are you doing, white person, to deal with racism in your community?
In yourself.
In yourself. And we got to do that.
So let me, Fraser Smith, what, if we could turn that around in terms of media and in terms of the way media frames stories, in terms of the questions that media ask, what would that look like? Because we know that most of the attitudes that we all have, media is the blood of all of this coursing through all of us. We get the same messages, all of us. So what change would there have to be in media in terms of the stories, in terms of the framing of the stories, in terms of who is in newsrooms? What would that need to look like to get to what Dr. Winbush is saying?
I'm not sure that I am in a position to comment on what electronic media, for example, could do. But one thing I'm thinking, listening to my colleagues here, is that one of the, I think, irrefutable facts of the Martin case is that if George Zimmerman is listening to the police when they tell him not to get out of the car, we don't have a murder. Now, what's the significance of that? It's going to be forever before we deal and cure racism. I think generationally it's happening. I think my kids are much more, they're much less affected by any thought at all about, some of the really nasty stuff that gets in your head about other people. It's not happening with kids because of media probably, and because of the experiences they've had. They literally do have black friends. My twins, their best friend, and you could never say this 30 years ago without being, you were definitely a racist if you said my best friends are black. But I'm talking about my kids. They went to school in the county they went to Grayson St. Peter's, which was 50-50, black and white. They went out in the county, and they came home and they said, they went to Notre Dame Prep. They came back and they said, where are the black people? And the only other black person that they knew was with their classmate from NDP that went out to the county. So, and you didn't ask me this, but let me just say one other thing that would be wonderful if we could, as a community, as a country, address, is this whole concept of restorative justice. It's the kind of, you're probably all familiar with this, where you, instead of trying to mete out justice in the courts, which we know there are many problems with, you do it at a community level, where the community comes together and addresses someone who has offended and gives them an opportunity to apologize and to talk about what led to the offense that they committed, or to hear them say, I do apologize. I'm aggrieved at what I have done, and I'm going to try to live a life in which that doesn't happen. And let me just go right back for a minute to my first point. Again, I don't think we have to address it. Ray is right. It has to be addressed by white people. But we also have to realize that succeeding there is probably not going to happen overnight. Well, what's the more practical thing that we can do? Professionalism with the police, rules and regulations in which probably white, powerful leaders are in charge of enforcing these things, so that now this situation got complicated because it was a community watch person, not a policeman, who didn't stay in his car. But it seems to me that somewhere along the line in that police department, they were saying to other policemen, be a little more sensitive. Just because somebody is wearing a hoodie or whatever other symbolic thing they're reacting to doesn't mean that this is somebody that needs to be arrested or hassled by you. This doesn't necessarily mean that you have to stop and frisk people. And I think that, if if that kind of accountability is enforced from the top by the white leaders, I mean, look, Baltimore doesn't have all white leaders. The police commissioner in Baltimore is not white. The last one was, but the current guy is not. So, I mean, I'd love to hear more conversation about that. But I think really it can be a little more complicated than maybe we're discussing at the moment.
And I think that's the complication is where conversations like this would really be helpful, and where we need to have other community conversations, because a point that I made earlier, that you can have someone who is a person of color in a powerful position, but if they are implementing the same unfair laws, the same unfair profiling expectations, then we still continue to get the same outcome. I want to hear, Ms. Roberson, your take on the whole idea of restorative justice. And could that be used as a tool that would help mitigate some of the disparities in terms of sentencing, as a tool to help eliminate the profiling? What exactly would that do in terms of flipping the script on these issues that we're talking about?
Ooh. I think it's got a place. Restorative justice is community-based. It takes people at the community level, and it takes the offender or whoever has done something wrong and holds them accountable immediately in a facilitated fashion. There's so much promise for restorative justice and different techniques. One of the things is that when we do start going community-based, communities can be vicious. I mean, like, I've been in small community. I lived in the Dominican Republic for a while, and what the community did when somebody was caught stealing a car, usually a black man, because it's the DR, is they would attack him, beat him up, and then turn him over to the police. So I think it has to, you have restorative justice, you have community-based conversations, you have very difficult conversations at the beginning of what is going on, and really addressing kind of what people are thinking, the biases that may go into it, or the trauma. Why did you do something for a kid? Why did you think it was okay to slap somebody? Whatever. But it does need to be done, I think, within structures and rules and laws. I like some formality, because I've seen what happens when that disappears, and it's not always good.
If the attitudes that people bring to the table, if the biases that they bring to the table are the same, then tell me how that restorative justice would play out on Mr. Neverdon.
Well, I think that with respect to, first and foremost, with restorative justice, we do get some semblance of that in the criminal justice system, where they have, in some cases, mediation. And I think that can be a good tool, but it has to be something looked at on a case-by-case basis. There are some neighborly disputes where the neighbors are plucking each other's nerves. Somebody wants to fight over 3 inches of being on their line, and they start doing things to one another, and it gets to a point that it can become sometimes violent. I've represented people in those cases where they will not let that inch go. But it does require getting skilled mediators to come in between them and get them to kind of understand, what is it, look at what you're really doing and get a better understanding of what's the real underlying issue. That's not going to work in every case. I mean, if you've got some kid who's run through the neighborhood who's got a drug addiction problem and he's robbing and stealing, we don't need a mediator to figure that out. He needs drug addiction and treatment and counseling. But there are some instances where that can work. But as a whole, I think that we've still got a lot of work to do as far as looking at that. I mean, and I keep going back to the fundamentals, just back to basics. The church, for me, the church was a very strong, solid institution that was responsible for picking up where parents did not, with mentoring and having activities for kids and being involved with things. And then you had the neighborhood in and of itself where there was community, where, you know, we reached out, we had extended community. You know, if I did something wrong down the street, I had a neighbor who would chastise me. And for some reason, we didn't have cell phones back then. By the time I got home, it was known what I had already done. And so everybody was kind of on the same accord. And so we have to kind of, to me, that's restorative justice, where we're taking responsibility for ourselves, where we have a level of love and respect for one another, that I can entrust that you're not going to abuse my child. You will get in their butt and you will tell them what was right and what was wrong, and I'm going to know about it. But that's basically the fundamentals that we've got to get back to, and we've got a lot of work to get back to that point. Neighbors don't trust one another right now. And we've got so many things going on where it comes to abuse. Somebody going beyond the point of dealing with that and addressing it. And so until you get a level of trust in any given community, when you're talking about restorative justice, you got to find out who has a bias, who's got a edge, you know, on their back, who's got something that you did something last year, you didn't invite me to a Christmas party and I got an issue, and now that I caught your child knocking over trash cans, you know, those are the kinds of things you got to be careful of with that.
So say that all of that happens. Say that our communities get back to that place where we're not as economically distressed, right? Where family units are stronger because the parents have economic opportunities, which a lot of parents in Baltimore and in older industrial cities across the country do not have. So say all of that happens and we are where we need to be. How would that change the biases in the criminal justice system? How would that change young men and women being profiled, being disproportionately brought up to trial and convicted? How would that change all of that?
Well, in a perfect world, or if we could, in a utopian concept, if all those things were in place, I don't think, and as was said right here, I don't think that instantaneously, or even, and I pray that I would see it in my lifetime before I close my eyes permanently, but I don't think that we're going to see, at least I won't, where racism is gone. Unfortunately, because it has such a long ingrained history, which has been a part of American society, as I said before, we are the sum of our experiences, and unfortunately, those behaviors, hate is a learned behavior that is transferred from one to another to another. It's generational. And so until we begin to deal with that, I think you're going to see some inroads, but ultimately, where opportunity is there, where other African Americans who are disproportionately underrepresented in the workplace, where we have those who are gainfully employed, people become less concerned about those of us who may otherwise have been profiled as breaking the law, with a better understanding that we are working, gainfully employed participants in society. We are part of the solution, not a part of the problem. People, and we can't get past this one point, that unfortunately, and as the doctor said, you know, white folk have a stereotype that, you know, black people as a whole, and this is not generally, but there has been this unspoken thing that when we're looked at, if you don't fit a certain quote unquote profile, where you're looked in a prestigious position, or you can be looked at and you're not compared to others or your counterparts, the first thing that is assumed that if you see a young black man in a brand new car, and I've seen it happen all the time, the first thing that you see the police do is they start following them. They're running that tag. Why is that? Why can't that be that young man's car that he's worked because he's working 2 jobs? Why can't that be because that happens to be his parents' car that they've just happened to give him permission to drive that time? Because institutionally, these are things that are ingrained, even in our African American police. It is how we are portrayed, and until we begin to eliminate the portrayal of what gives us a first impression before he opens up his mouth, and we start already casting images of what that person is about, we still got a long way to go, and we've got a lot of problems to work out.
So Dr. Winbush, the protests happening around the country, not just about Trayvon Martin, but Fraser Smith mentioned the Fruitvale Station and the execution of Oscar Grant. So the protests that continue to happen in the face of injustice. And a lot of times leading the protests are youth who really are on the front lines of this injustice. Do you think that that is helping, that it is helping communities get braver? Do you think that it is helping change the way society thinks about, in particular, young black men? What role do you think that these protests are playing in effecting change?
Well, I've been really looking at the Dream Defenders. I don't know how many of you know about them, but they've been sitting in now for 28 days in the Florida Capitol. They're young people. They remind me of the old SNCC, how SNCC started 40, 50 years ago in the United States. I also think that it will help empower young people. And I probably slightly disagree with Fraser, because it seems that every time there's like these racial coalitions in American history, that we start getting hopeful. So after the Civil War, they said, well, the abolitionist movement was going to, among whites, was going to usher in a new era, and it didn't. And then in the Civil Rights era, the hippies. Anybody remember hippies? Okay, well, the young people don't know what I'm talking about, but the older people do. And the hippies are going to change things, and they didn't. And so I think that we've got to understand that, again, quoting Derek Bell, a legal scholar, says that it's part of the fabric of this society. There are two utopian black communities that we already have the answer to that question. One was called Rosewood, Florida, and the other one was called the Greenwood District of Tulsa, Oklahoma. 100% employment, no crime, and they were both burned to the ground by a society that didn't value black people. Last thing I want to say is, on a very practical solution, if I was mayor of Baltimore, Maryland, I could reduce crime. I could reduce police criminal activity by almost 67%. In Rialto, California, just about a year ago, they installed or attached to every police officer a camera, little tiny camera. It was a reduction in police violence of 67%. See, that's something because somebody's watching. Something very, very simple. And if you want to get pessimism, you shouldn't end on Norm Stamper, who's the former police chief of Seattle, a white guy, wrote a book called Breaking Ranks. And in his book, he says that it is embedded in the police culture to hate and watch out for black men. This is a former police chief who said that. The FOP they really don't like him because when he wrote this stuff. And one other final thing. This Saturday, I'm going to be in Phoenix, Arizona with Trayvon Martin's mother and the lawyer, Benjamin Crump. And we decided that, and they wanted me to come out there because they want to start talking more about race and the Trayvon Martin decision. They kind of hesitate to talk about it, the way Barack Obama hesitates to talk about it. Because when he talked about it just about 3 weeks ago, you saw with everybody's, he's creating racial division in America. Well, that's what they said. So I think that we've got to include race and racism in the dialogue, and we've got to put it out there, not apologize for it, and say it, because that's what it really is all about.
Thank you. I want to open for questions, but before I do, I want to go back to one thing, and particularly get all of our panelists' thoughts about this. We oftentimes hear that that racism, that implicit bias, that all of that is less in the millennials, in the Gen Ys, in younger generations, and we cite the increase in interracial friendships, interracial marriage, whatever, our proximity to each other, whatever. But every time when there is a poll or a study where the question is about power dynamics, where the question is about resources, you see that the younger generation has the same attitudes as prior generations. So
The 1%.
yeah. So can you speak about that? Because it for me, it just gets to, what is the reality in America? And not to be pessimistic, but I'm just saying that we have to kind of separate fact from fiction, and so that we can really take a clear view and come up with different strategies and see where we are. So do you think that that's true? Do you think those studies are false? Tell me what your sense is, if you all know, anybody.
Well, thank you. Well, I was just reading a study about implicit bias in determining culpability. And this is a December 2012 study. So it's not actually new, it's repeating what's been told. And what they did is they gave people sort of scenarios of someone committing a crime, and the one thing they changed, the only thing they changed, it was like a 15-year-old kid, the only thing they changed was the race of the kid. And consistently, even people who swear that they are, they have no biases, consistently they would think of the kid as more adult, would want to transfer them, treat them as an adult, would want to sentence them more harshly if the kid was African American, and this is consistent. I think what we, when people are saying, it's getting better, it probably is getting better, maybe, but it has to be confronted. The problem with implicit biases is it's there, but nobody really talks about it. And God help us if you're trying to talk to a white liberal about racism, it's like so much angst and no one wants to talk about it. It has to be deconstructed. You have to look at the structures. You have to look at what it is that we are working within and really try and deconstruct where are the points at which your biases are making a difference in the decisions that you are making and how you are acting or how you are funding, which is what I talk about a lot, things like that. So no, implicit biases are still there. I say stuff I'm ashamed of. I can't imagine that other people aren't holding this. I mean, we are inundated with visions and images and news, and our parents, it's not going to disappear overnight.
I wholeheartedly agree that, and as I said from the very beginning, we are the sum of our experiences, and we're dealing with a generational issue. I would have to say, though, on the flip side, I am seeing, particularly with teenagers, I am seeing more diversity as far as an understanding, because I think that kids are beginning to do what we weren't able to do, which is find more commonality, that they all dealing with some of the same issues. I can't stand my parents either. So, it's just an example. But when you're dealing with teenagers and they grow up and they begin to learn a certain level of independence, they are becoming more open and more apt to thinking outside the box. And so they have more common ground to kind of find mutual things that they share. We're dealing with a hip-hop culture, we're dealing with music, we're dealing with dance. I forgot some of the movies where everybody's dancing on the screen, and the whole, I guess it's the new version of the old musicals where they're breakdancing and stuff like that. That's something that's transcending across all racial barriers. But the issue becomes when the movie is over, what is the mindset when they walk out of that theater? And that's what I mean when I keep saying we are the sum of our experiences. I think there is becoming more racial tolerance, but I want to move away from, me personally, I would like to see us move away from racial tolerance and begin to develop a better terminology of racial understanding. And I think that that's where we begin to see a difference in how we treat one another. I mean, the first thing is universally, we have to understand and accept that we are human beings first and foremost. We just happen to have different hues in our complexion. One of us produces more melanin than the other. And so, because we all bleed red. Some of us may not think that, but we all bleed red. And if I take your green money out your pocket, you also have the same lint that I have, if that's the circumstance. But those are some hardcore things that we've got to get back to, that we have to get to a point of racial understanding and stop trying to always find racial differences and say that we need to be more tolerant. I don't think that another human being needs to be tolerant of anything, and I sure don't want myself, my children, anyone in my family to be tolerated. I want to be understood and accepted, not tolerated. Tolerated is, to me, is such a negative word. It means that I'm just barely dealing with you because I have to or because somebody dictates that that's what it is. And that's, for me, not a good place to start.
Thank you. I would like to invite anyone who has a question or comment to please just form a line over there, and you can step up and use that mic. Thank you. Just one?
I need some help. Racism. That seems to be the gist of what's going on.
Could you speak louder?
That seems that racism is the gist of what the panel is saying. It's the problem in society today.
Thank you. Thank you, Moss.
I think before we can even talk about racism, we have to define what white supremacy racism is, where it is, what it does, and how to deal with that. Because we can't really deal with bias and prejudice and bigotry unless we deal with the core root of our ills in society, which is white supremacy, racism.
Thank you.
My name is Brian Murray. It's been my experience in my occupation to run across a number of people, and I've actually had some heated discussion with some folks about the term white supremacy and the term racism, simply because what it provokes is people putting their dukes up, which takes the productiveness out of the conversation. And in the context of all of this chatter nationally about having a national conversation, and we've already talked about the fact that in the context of the United States, that the majority of talking needs to happen with white people. I'd be interested in anybody responding to the fact that perhaps we may need to use some other terms. We've heard a lot of talk about structural privilege, and that people may put their dukes up at being called a racist, but people who are very well-intentioned, people who have never committed an offensive act to anyone in their lifetime, someone of another color, may be able to see that they are a bystander and a consumer of structural privilege. Because you talked about
Roberson.
You talked about the media.
Oh, Mr. Smith.
Mr. Smith. But the simple reality in the media is that although meth is the #1 used drug in this country, we got the guy who stars in, I don't even look at the show, Breaking Bad, is on the cover of TV Guide. There's something wrong with the fact that he is a cancer survivor involved in some criminal acts, but somebody else is an inherent criminal. So we gotta, I heard the word deconstruct how we have the conversation. And when white people begin to talk to white people who begin to become defensive, perhaps somebody can respond and help me to understand how that conversation would go. Because you talked about your kids having black friends. My kids are now graduated from college. They dated interracially, they still befriended interracially. But what they've learned is that it's not about intent, it's about impact. And when there's a benefit to the impact, it begins to separate the most well-intentioned. So I say all that to say, how can we encourage people and give them the tools to have a constructive conversation about race? We cannot continue to dance because we the people wasn't all we. It was white male landowners. And we're centuries down the road, and we all understand that, and we're all trying to get to a better standard of living for everyone. So perhaps someone who is not African American can talk about how that conversation needs to be done.
Can I just take moderator's privilege no, you didn't. This forum is being hosted and put on by Baltimore Racial Justice Action Network. This is a multiracial network where in that network these types of conversations happen all the time, and where individuals are given tools to talk productively in whatever forum. We have consulted for companies, for faith-based institutions, for nonprofit organizations in different communities. We have two arms. One is our Baltimore anti-racist activist of color. I always forget our acronym. It's horrible. And then another is WARN, the White Anti-Racist Network. So we do our work separate, because there are spaces where white people need to talk to white people, and where people of color need to talk to people of color, because we got our own stuff to deconstruct and our own healing to do. And then there are times when we come together, but in this group, everybody comes out with language, with an understanding of the difference between the personal, the interpersonal, the institutional, and the structural. And that is critically important, because a lot of times we talk about those four as if they're just one thing. And they're not one thing. And we all do it without calling folk racist. We talk about white supremacy and the history of white supremacy. So I want to assure you that these types of conversations happen all the time in Baltimore. And if anyone is interested in having a better understanding, solid language, solid tools and skills to better have these conversations, you want to see the woman at the registration table, our administrator, Miss Diane Leday, or go to the website, which is, Sina? BeMoreAntiracist.org, and we can have these types of conversations. This forum happens tonight and on the 13th of each and every single month, because it is an extension of the conversations that we have, and our agreement with you, Brian, that we need to have safe spaces, not necessarily comfortable, but safe, in order to have these types of conversations. So if you want a white person to answer, I'm glad to yield the floor.
And I apologize. I know that the justice system was a launching point.
Yeah, but this is good.
It took a lot of different directions.
This is all good. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, Bilal?
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody who put this together, because I think it's long overdue that we do have some type of dialogue, conversation about race. What really gravitated me to come here tonight was I had heard Adar on Anthony McCarthy's show, and being that the Trayvon Martin case was out there, but we know it's a whole lot of other Trayvon Martins that don't get mentioned or get the national attention. But one of the things that I find very interesting, especially in Baltimore City, and a lot of people resonate with the same type of thoughts, is that in the criminal justice system, you only get as much justice as you can afford. And that's basically the underlying premise that a lot of, especially Afro-Americans who are constantly confronted with law enforcement. The other thing that I agree with, that I heard one of the panel mention, was that the laws are the rules that govern us. But historically, these laws have been codified to put other groups of people at a disadvantage, especially Afro Americans. And we can go back to Brown versus Board of Education. I think it was Ferguson versus Plessy with the separate but equal. Now we move fast forward, we have a current case with historically black colleges with unequal distribution of being funded like other universities that are in the University of Maryland system, and it's just one system. And then we come to this stand, your ground law. And that law is racist in and of itself. You can sugarcoat it however you want to, saying, well, we have a right to defend ourselves and all that, but it goes back to what you had said earlier, what was the intent? You know, had he listened to the dispatcher saying, hey, do not follow him, you don't have no legal right to pursue this kid, and because we are so stereotyped, if you have a hoodie on or you just happen to be walking while black, you are subject to being, I see it all the time when I ride through the city, black kids sitting on the curb. And I'm saying, what type of policy is this? And on the last note, I agree with you that the top prosecutor is the symbol for how justice will be distributed in the city. And on that note, I think that the current state's attorney has fell very short on that in terms of how he is applying and how he is interpreting certain things that relate to different people. And I think he's such a polarizing figure at this point that we do need some change. I'll just say that on that note.
Thank you so much. I heard two questions that I really would like our panel to address. But before that, I want to go back and just thank Brian, because I think you opened the door to a question that we're going to address, that I'm going to ask a BRJA Warren member, Dottie Burke-Markowitz, to address at the end, because it is so important, Brian, and that is how we have these conversations with white people and keep the conversation productive instead of getting people defensive. And that deserves a bit more of an answer. So I want to ask you, Dottie, if you will, to say a couple of words before we end, because that would be a great learning to take from the room, and I thank you for raising that. Bilal, I heard two things that I'd like for our panel to address, and one is this whole issue of if you are rich, you will get justice, or you will get only as much justice as your wallet will buy. The other question was, or the contention was, that the stand your ground law is inherently racist. So is it inherently racist? So the two lawyers on the panel, if you can please address those questions, that you only have as much justice as your wallet will buy, and stand your ground law is being inherently racist. Your comments?
Well, from a private defense attorney standpoint, I think that as anybody who has benefited and has been able to provide for your family, that you have an affirmative duty and obligation. I would say probably 25 to 30% of my cases that I deal with on a yearly basis end up being pro bono. And when I say that, it comes in many forms. I've had people write me from prison where I've addressed cases for them. I've taken on cases that people start off, they don't have enough money to do certain things. And so there has to be an obligation that it's about justice and not about always the monetary aspect of it. And I found that, number one, it has enriched my life, because I would say probably of those that I do that for, 90% of them call me back to say, you know what, you gave me a break when nobody else would. Let me tell you what's going on with my life right now. I'm gainfully employed. I'm taking care of my family. I've been able to do certain things with my kids. I now have visitation with the kids, and you were instrumental in that. And so to a large part of it, look, we live in a litigious society. And the name of the game is if I can make you spend as much money as you have to until somebody taps out. And that's really what it's about. But if you have those, and what we have a lot of times in the, particularly in the public defender's office, you've got some incredible attorneys who are there doing it. I mean, and they make a difference. You've got a lot of those of us in the private sector that make a difference.
Neverdon, do you think that your philosophy, your commitment to pro bono service, do you think that is the exception or the rule? Because that's what I heard as Bilal's question.
Well, I think that, let me put it this way. With monumental bar, a lot of us who are in private practice, that is the rule. A lot of us donate time to those who are considered indigent, who don't have enough to necessarily do what's necessary.
Attorney Roberson.
So I work in public interest, and I think you're supposed to donate time if you're a private attorney, but the problem is that the need is greater than the resources that are available. Thank you. That's the problem.
So, did you have a comment about that?
I just wanted to say one thing. I don't know if it's been verified in Baltimore, but I've heard recently that the prosecutors across the board are getting more resources and the public defenders are being cut. Yeah. Now, is that structural racism? I would say it might be. I tell you, if I don't know if the movie is available, but it's impossible, I would think, to see Fruitvale Station and not understand structural racism in our country. You're talking about a young man who at some point was in jail. He's trying to put his life back together. He's not finding any assistance except from his family who are supporting him. And he gets on a train and he runs into a guy that he knew in prison, and there's an altercation and it leads to his death. I mean, that kind of narrative, I think if a lot of people saw that, their eyes would open. And just one other point about restorative justice. Underlying the conversation, particularly in the context of the epidemic of incarceration in our country, who do you think has benefited from this ostensibly? You know, from all of this excess incarceration. It's been done on behalf, and I think sometimes it has happened not by purpose, as my kids would say, or used to say, but it's just been a result of this set of laws that were passed because white people, and I'm not excluding black people, were afraid of drug crime. And so you get all of these excessive penalties that put the prosecutors where the judge ought to be and take judging out of the whole context. And this is what you get. So if you had a society-wide restorative justice system, this brings us back to the question of justice, people would say, we need to weigh in on behalf of justice, and since we were the ostensible beneficiaries of it, let's assume our responsibility for getting us back to closer what justice is.
Thank you. So I want to get to your other question. The stand your ground, is that an inherently racist law concept? Attorney Neverdon? Yes or no?
Yeah, it's unequivocally, it is.
Okay, and
Yeah.
Attorney Roberson?
It's just stupid. It's a stupid law. It's a stupid concept that needs to go.
Can I say one quick?
Yeah, so one quick thing, and then we'll come back to the how is it racist? I heard that question. Okay, go ahead.
Here's the thing. We dance around a lot of issues. The question was, you only get as much justice as you can afford. I'm not talking about what the Monumental Bar Association or what private attorneys donate in terms of pro bono. I'm talking about the reality that people that are impacted by the law who enters this system, you know as well as I know, if they don't have resources to have the proper representation, they're not going to get justice as opposed to somebody who's coming in there who they commonly call as a public pretender, and I'm saying it's a good people, and public defender. But you have a lot of public pretenders who never see their client, and when court day, they come with a stack of files, and you know that, and so that's not true. So,
Thank you, Bilal. So let me, wait, I just want to, how many people agree with what Bilal said? Don't be shy. How many people agree? So whether it is true or not, certainly the perception, at least in this room, and I think it would be fair to say for most of Baltimore, is that you get what you pay for, you get what you can buy. Whether it's true or not, if that's the perception, then there is something that needs to be addressed and corrected. You can go to the, would you, did you have something just on this? Because I don't want to disrespect the people who, okay, do you all mind if she makes a comment on this? Okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say from a perspective of, I was a prosecutor in Baltimore City for 6 years. And so the point that Bilal brings up about justice having to do with how much money you have, I can say from my perspective, that is the case. Time and time again, you would see, some individuals who had the means to hire 2 attorneys to go to trial. Those individuals would have, top of the line attorneys, and then you have public defenders who are hardworking, dedicated public servants, but by the same token, they are inundated with case files. So you don't necessarily get the kind of time and attention that a private attorney, or 2 private attorneys for that matter, would. I actually had a case with Russell Neverdon where there was an individual who hired 2 attorneys in the case when I prosecuted the case. But I say all that to say, we're talking about as well, your second question was the laws. I think that, and you asked, how is the law racist?
Yes.
I don't necessarily agree that the law is racist. I think it's the application of the laws. And when you look at the history, every time and time again, all the way back to Plessy versus Ferguson, with the outright, them saying that separate but equal, it has been the application of these laws. So you look at what happened in New York, the stop and frisk, Terry v. Ohio, these laws are on the books and they are good laws, but it's the way in which they are applied that is the problem. How do you address that? You ask that question of your panelists. You have to have individuals who see from a perspective of the community, who understand that the application of these laws are being applied in ways that are unequal. And there are disparities in the criminal justice system. Ultimately, that's the only way that you're going to be able to address it. Russell touched on the point of these young children who come together and they're able to be more tolerant of one another because they have that exposure. That's the same sort of thing that has to happen on an adult level. You have to have that sort of exposure, and the only way that you can is if you have individuals in those positions.
Thank you, and we're asking everybody who's speaking to give their name, so.
Oh, my name is Marilyn Mosby.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you so much. And was, for the person who said, how is it racist, was your question answered?
We could talk about stand your ground.
Yes, and did she answer it? Excellent, thank you. So, ma'am, come up to the mic, and your name is?
My name is Heather Fogg, and I am so excited to have heard the terms restorative justice and mediation, because I've been thinking about those, and that's the area that I work in, as one way to address these things. And then at recent trainings and conferences, the question came up, and you gave me a better way to put it, of is there restorative justice in the racism? And is there mediation in the racism? And trying to grapple with that, as that was the place where I felt the most to address our broken system that works perfectly if you're me and works really poorly if you're somebody who's not like me. That's not okay. So trying to find that place where restorative justice and mediation and those applications could come in, and then to have it highlighted that as we're trying to structuralize those things, look again who's structuralizing them. And is what do we do with that? What do we do about that? And that's terrifying, because that's been my answer for a while, and now suddenly trying to figure out how to still have that be my answer of what to do with this horrible system that we have, and what what to work toward instead, and how to work toward it in a way that isn't just going to duplicate the same structure we have now.
Thank you so much. Anybody on the panel want to comment on that? Okay, then, yes, ma'am. And your name?
Hello, my name is Jatem Ross. I'm from Jackson, Mississippi, by way of Saginaw, Michigan. I've been living in Baltimore for about a year. So my question is really short, and it might be more so directed towards the attorneys on the panel. I was wondering, concerning the Trayvon Martin case, do you think that if the element of race had been included in the prosecution, it would have had a better outcome on a more equitable outcome? Because from what I understand, they avoided taking the stance of racism. They didn't want to make it a race issue. So do you think that was something, was that a mistake on the part of the prosecution?
Well, I'm not even sure if this is working. Okay, as far it is, okay. All right. The issue with Trayvon Martin, is, as I alluded to before, was you can't get away from the racial undertones. Bringing it out to the forefront because of how it was publicized, I think would have taken away from the ability to focus on the law and getting a solid conviction. You can't get around that. And when you look at it as to how it was set up and the kinds of things that were brought out, there were things that were, a term that we use, were suppressed. Some of the recordings of what was actually being said, of what Zimmerman was saying, was being suppressed. So from a judicial standpoint, the judges had made a determination that I'm not going to allow certain things to come in because he didn't want that to incite emotions to come into play. You know, from a prosecutorial standpoint, you've got to be able to know your audience, and that is your prospective jurors, and understand what you're dealing with from that realm. And so in dealing with that, you've got to be able to say, how do I deal with this case in such a way that I can get the core facts conveyed? There's a way of doing it and saying that it is clear, unequivocally clear, that this was racially motivated without having to put that in the forefront, but still have it factually based. We know, look, listen, play that tape over and over again, how he's describing him. Play that tape over and over again when he gives this fake description of he's reaching into his waistband, his dip area. Oh, no, he's not. Now he's turned around and gone in the opposite direction. You have to focus on critical points that clearly show he was the aggressor. It was his intent to confront him. That's how you got to deal with it. And there are ways of conveying that without pulling out the race card, because you don't want to get lost in translation, that it's a race issue and justice is overlooked. And how they dealt with it, how they presented the case, to me was problematic. I think that they put so much out there that it was befuddling. It was just you left a trail of breadcrumbs that really did not lead that jury in the right direction for where they needed to go. And so, you know, like anything else, there has to be what I call prosecutorial responsibility when you're dealing with cases. Each case should be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. And as Ms. Mosby mentioned earlier, you know, there are cases where, you know, where people have to deal, you pay what you get, but you also have to look at, from the prosecutor's standpoint, you also, because you have the ear of the court for the most part. When we deal with plea deals, you have the ear of the court. You have to be responsible and take a stand and say, I will not go forward with certain cases where it doesn't merit out, where it doesn't make sense, and where this person should not be in this situation in the first place.
And let's leave it there so that we can move on to other questions. Thank you so much. And your name?
My name is Rolisha Martin. I'm from the Eastern Shore, but I've been in Baltimore for 10 years, even though I was in Nashville for 2 years. But yeah, that's beside the point. Anyway, so I have two questions. The first one is, do you think that, this is to anybody, do you think that the racial profiling and other, you know, instances that we're experiencing have anything or is in any way connected to the fact that Black history as a whole, especially the civil rights movement, is not being taught in the K through 12 levels, or very limited in that fact. And then my second question is, how do you train officials that are in, powerful, how do you train officials that are in positions of authority, those that have historically not been receptive to the idea that blacks are not necessarily equal to whites? So how do you get someone that hasn't been receptive to then learn, how to treat someone that is supposedly beneath them? Thank you.
Thank you. And we need very concise answers because we want to get to other questioners in.
Well, I don't want to sound jaded, but I don't think you can do that, sister. And then very quickly, this will be a 20-second answer. Again, I recommend reading Derek Bell's book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well. There's a chapter in there, I think it's called something like Towards Racial Realism. Bell says we shouldn't talk about optimism, we shouldn't talk about pessimism, but he talks about realism. And I think we've got to be realistic about how embedded racism is in every aspect, not only of the criminal justice. I'm an educator. It's in the educational system. It's everywhere I go. So we've got to really understand that. And to me, that's the part. So again, I don't want to be jaded, but.
I do have a question, just a comment. I missed what you said about the main one.
Faces at the Bottom of the Well by Derek Bell, legal scholar. Excellent book.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Your name?
I'm Eva. I'm a member of WARN and BRJA. I just recently got an email from a friend of mine, a white woman. I'd asked her what she thought of the verdict. She said, "It bothers me that the case became solely about race because blacks kill other blacks all the time and no one bats an eye. But as soon as a Mexican, sidebar who's not Mexican, is involved, it becomes about race." So I almost said, I don't think we should talk about this anymore, but I didn't. I tried to respond, but I've heard this from other people, white and a couple Latinos alike, and I think my perspective is they're using this, oh, but what if Zimmerman had been black? Or, oh, but Zimmerman was part Latino, this means it couldn't have been about race because he's a victim of oppression too. As an excuse to avoid confronting the race in this trial and this whole situation. But I would love to hear from either the panelists or folks in the room, what's a good way of derailing that derailing?
Well, in the interest of time, let's, because we could do another 2 hours just on that. Do our panelists have anything to say?
I want to say real quick, I think we should start talking about white-on-white crime and connect it. I mean, it's amazing that when, race is an issue, that we connect things that aren't even connected. I could connect the Newtown shooting, when the kids got killed up in, exactly. But what if I started saying, well, you know how those white people are, they just kill each other all the time. I just read right before I came here about some guy up in Alaska, Sarah Palin's hometown or whatever. He's killed 11 people around the world. But we don't see people getting afraid of white males as serial killers. You see, we don't see that. So I think that, your friend or colleague or whoever she is, she's got to really think and be realistic about this was about race. And Zimmerman declared himself, he had what is called white skin privilege. And that's a whole nother discussion, as Adar just said, but he claimed white skin privilege. I don't want to get into it, but I was having a dialogue similar to a white female about 3 days ago on Facebook, and she said that her great-grandmother was Aboriginal, so she wasn't white. I said, well, how do you classify yourself? She said, I don't want to answer that. I said, how do you? No, this is a true story. You can go look on my Facebook page. I asked her 3 times. She finally said, I am white. Now, she talked about her great-grandmother, whoever it was an Aboriginal. but she claimed white skin privilege. And that's what your friend is doing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, and then our last questioner.
Sorry, I just want to try really briefly to offer also that what I heard in what you said was that when that conversation started, the first feeling was sort of like, oh, I don't want to talk about that. And that's the big hurdle, I think, of we might not talk about it perfectly every time, but getting over that I don't want to talk about it, because now we just went to a place where we're going to disagree and we're going to have to fight about this as white people, is the big hurdle of no, dampen that right the hell down and jump into, I got to talk about that. It's going to be ugly and I'm going to make mistakes and we're going to make each other mad, but I got to talk about it.
And this is where having the language and the tools to do so would be so helpful. And yes.
My name is Marilyn Mosby. I was a prosecutor in Baltimore City for 6 years, as I stated earlier. And I'm originally from Massachusetts. I was a part of a desegregation, one of the longest standing desegregation programs in the nation. So from second grade until I graduated high school, I was bused from Boston, in the inner city of Boston, to Dover, Sherborne, which was one of the richest towns in Massachusetts. I say all that to say that I was also a part of the American Civil Liberties Union. I studied the Civil Rights Movement. I wanted to become a prosecutor because I wanted to reform the criminal justice system. And I looked at the inequities and the Black community, and it was something that inspired me to want to reform it. And one of your questions was, should we have brought up race in this Trayvon Martin case? And from a prosecutor's perspective, because that's what I did for 6 years, I would disagree with Mr. Neverdon, and I would say yes. And on a fundamental basis, I think nationally, we always try to avoid the issue, which is the big elephant in the room. So did the prosecutor mess up in the Trayvon Martin case? I would say she absolutely did. And I think that because it was the elephant in the room, it should have been addressed. Because what it allowed for the jurors to then do, when everybody across the nation knew that intent, when he got out of that vehicle, when he got out and he was told to stay in his vehicle and to not follow that child, he was looking at this kid with a hoodie on, Skittles and an Arizona tea, didn't know what he had in his pockets. It had everything to do with race. And by not addressing the elephant in the room, it allowed the jurors to hide and say for other reasons and give other justifications for why he was not guilty. We find this time and time again, O.J. Simpson, Rodney King, countless examples where in American history, we do not want to confront race. And that's the problem. How do we avoid it? We have to address it, we have to talk about it, and we have to confront it. And I think this is the kind of forum, this kind of forum is great because that's what's needed. We have to stop being so sensitive when it comes to race because it's something that affects every aspect of our life. And when people can hide behind it, they will. And we see that time and time again. So I would say from a prosecutor's perspective, no, we should have brought that up. And I can tell you that would have been the elephant in the room, and I would have brought that up, and that would have been the main talking point.
Thank you. So with that, that is perfect to move into how we talk about it. And so before we end, let's just take a couple minutes to do that. And going back to Brian's question earlier, Dottie of Baltimore Racial Justice Action, if you can talk about just talking about it with white people and not letting it be the elephant in the room. And then Tori McReynolds of BRJA BACO, if you can say just a few words for those people who might be interested in learning the language and the tools, just say a couple more words about BRJA trainings. And Dottie, you can do so too.
I have terrible laryngitis. And I could at any moment go into a coughing fit. So that happens, I will stop. Talking to other white people about racism, white supremacy. one of the discussions we have on an ongoing basis within BRJA and particularly within WARN is about how to engage white people in the conversation about white supremacy and racism. And we readily acknowledge that it's not always the best strategy to start out with those terms. It very much depends on the group that we're talking with, the people who are in the room, and where they're entering that conversation. We need to be realistic about that starting place if we want people to have any openness about having the conversation. At the same time, if we never get to those terms, we never get to the reality of the real issues. For me personally, being raised in the incredibly racist town of East St. Louis, Illinois, by a white family who for some reason didn't fit in with their racial attitudes with just about every other white person in my experience and actively taught us how wrong racism was. It was easy for me to distance myself from the term racism, to kind of put that on other white people. I certainly acknowledge that it existed, but it didn't resonate for me personally. But when I began getting involved with groups like BRJA and learned to redefine the term white supremacy to not mean people with hoods who are going out and committing direct violence against people of color, and particularly African Americans, then I really began to understand that no matter how much I didn't want to see myself as racist, I had been from the day I was born taught that I was superior, and that it would be a lifelong struggle for me to uncover all the ways in which that affected the way I thought about things, the way I treated people, the way I behaved, the decisions that I made. So I think it's essential for those of us who are white and have all had that indoctrination all of our lives, no matter how much our families might have tried to teach racial justice to us, it's around us constantly. I think it's absolutely necessary to get from wherever people are open to an initial conversation to a deep understanding of how embedded white supremacy and racism is in everything in our culture. I think I got to stop.
Thank you so much. And I hope that that's answered, in part, some questions. Tori, for people who want to know more, other than getting on the BRJA mailing list so that you can receive notice of 13th of the month event, which happens when? 13th of the month. What should people do?
Other than being on our mailing list, and originally which is a great thing to do, go to our website, bemoreantiracist.org. Yes, there's an instruction implicit in that website title. bemoreantiracist.org. Please go to that. There's a lot of information there. There's some language, as Adar was talking about. There's a lot of information that can help you understand the perspective of BRJA and what we're about and how we understand these terms. There's really quite a wealth of information. Other events similar to this are on our website. But originally Adar had asked me to, we're on Facebook also. Are we tweeting? Yes. And we're tweeting?
Yes.
I don't use Twitter, we're tweeting on Facebook. You can find us out there on our website. You can find us on the interwebs. We're also, as much as we can, he'll allow us, we're on the Nate McCarthy show. We call him at least once a month to plug these events. So there are many, many ways to connect with us and to keep having these conversations. To your point earlier, though, Adar, asking me to sort of be the other side of it, because as has been mentioned, within BRJA, there are a couple of discussion groups, WARN, which Dottie spoke to, the White Anti-Racism Network, and then there's BACO, Baltimore Activists of Color Organized for Equity, BACOE. And what being involved with BACO has been for me is really three main things. It's offered me support, growth, and an opportunity for action. It has offered me support as a person of color who wants to have these conversations, who wants to go deeper, who wants to understand this for myself, for my community, for my future, who wants to understand this on an intellectual level, on a personal level. This has been a tremendous opportunity, being involved with BACO, to get the support that is so lacking, because so many people don't want to talk about it. Whether you don't want to talk about it because you receive privilege, and all of us, no matter what our background is, do have areas of privilege in our lives, and we talk about that in BACO. Whether you don't want to talk about it because you feel like you have a lot of privilege, or you don't want to talk about it because you feel like you're getting stomped on all the time. Still, being involved and having that opportunity provides support, it provides growth, because as I was just mentioning, those areas of privilege come up and get discussed relentlessly, and again, and we come back to it, and we keep trying, and we keep working at it. And then finally, there's action. As has been mentioned before, BRJA consults. We offer trainings, we offer events such as these that you're at right now. That opportunity for action, to take it all out of the realm of the theoretical, out of the realm of the discussion group, and put it into the public sphere, and have all of you come and be part of it. I can't think of anything better to do with my time.
Well, thank you so much, and I'd also like to extend a very big thank you to our panelist, Dr. Ray Winbush, who continues to be a great resource and give of his time. Thank you so much. Attorney Camilla Roberson of the Public Justice System, a great sister. Thank you so much. Attorney Russell Neverdon, we so appreciate you and hope that you'll come back and join us on other forums.
I will.
And Fraser Smith, thank you so much, and we hope that you will come back and join us again. Thank you. Most importantly, though, I really want to thank you all, because of all the things that you could have chosen to do with your evening, you chose to spend it with us and talking about these issues, and we are grateful. Please, there is information from Associated Black Charities, my other organizational love, on the table for you. Please pick it up, take it home, and we hope to see you at next month's 13th of the month event, where we're going to talk about race and mental health. Thank you again. Enjoy the ride home.